So during the first 5 years that NXIVM was around, it grew exponentially. The organization amassed over 3,700 regular participants, including notable executives, entrepreneurs, socialites, and actors. Of particular note were Mexico's president's daughter, Ana Cristina Fox, as well as Claire and Sarah Bronfman, who are heiresses to the Seagram liquor fortune. Now, I wanted to briefly just talk about the Bronfman family for a second, because the Bronfman family ended up being one of the biggest financiers of NXIVM and is still in control of NXIVM today. Some people have compared the Bronf family as, North America's Rothschild family. Like, they've got significant wealth that goes back generations and generations. They're a Canadian-American Jewish family, and it owes its initial fame to Samuel Bronfman back in 1889, who made a fortune in the alcoholic distilled beverage business during American Prohibition. And that was the Seagram family. Now, what's interesting is that Claire and Sarah's father, Edgar Bronfman Sr., knew about what was going on in NXIVM, and he was deeply concerned about what things were going on and what he had heard, and he wanted to know what his girls were up to because he was worried about them. Now, this is kind of jumping ahead to court documents, but I think it's important to understand this right now, is that later on court documents would reveal the massive gutting by the Bronfman daughters of their family trust funds to help finance NXIVM and the alleged investment schemes of its leader, Keith Raniere. The amount, reportedly $100 million, was what was released. But according to legal filings and public documents, in the last 6 years, as much as $150 million were taken out of the Bronfman's trusts and bank accounts, including $66 million allegedly used to cover Keith's failed bets in the commodities market. That's fucking crazy. They literally gave him $65 million that he fucking lost, just straight up lost playing the commodities market, as well as $30 million to buy real estate in Los Angeles and around Albany, $11 million for a 22-seat, 2-engine jet, and millions more to support a barrage of lawsuits across the country against NXIVM's enemies. So literally the Bronfman family, NXIVM really couldn't have been what it ended up being without the support. And what's interesting is a lot of people put the Edgar Sr., the father, says, he knew about it, but how much did he really know? So the fact that they were siphoning so much money from him and from the family fortune into this is very concerning. And, the fact that Claire Bronfman is now in control of it to this day, now that Keith's out of it. But we'll talk about that more in a sec. But this was interesting to me, is that Claire is quoted as saying that when talking about, Keith hedging his bets in the commodities market and all of that, she said, unfortunately, my father, Edgar Bronfman Sr., he wanted to thwart Keith's investments, so he manipulated the entire commodities market in tandem with the Illuminati. And that was a quote unquote statement that Claire Bronfman made about her father, which is interesting because that's where people think that, the Bronfman, along with these other elite families that we've talked about before, are involved in, the New World Order conspiracy and the Illuminati and all of that. And literally we have a statement where she says exactly that her father's working with them. Damn. I just thought that was really interesting. Another interesting thing to know about Claire Bronfman and the Bronfman family was that they are involved in, supporting political figures, including making a large contribution to the Clinton campaign. And Claire's brother, Stephen, also is the biggest contributor to the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau's campaign. So, a lot of people go wild with the conspiracies with those two and, the histories and all of that. But I think it's interesting to note that the Bronfmans are tied in with the Clintons, especially, tied into NXIVM and all this. Yeah. It's like taking contributions from everybody, man. And from shady people. But eventually NXIVM caught the attention of Rick Allen Ross, a cult investigator. And in the early 2000s, he obtained copies of NXIVM's manual. Participating members were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. When excerpts from the manual were published on Ross's website, along with a professional assessment from a psychiatrist who labeled it, quote unquote, expensive brainwashing, NXIVM responded by suing the Ross Institute and the member who leaked the manual for copyright infringement. So there you go, silencing people that are, leaking any sort of information or truth from their organization. And they were all under the impression that the outlet was writing a positive story on how NXIVM helped people. While the cases were eventually dismissed, they sent a powerful message of swift retaliation to anyone who defied NXIVM. And that's like one of the biggest things with them, and where they draw similarities with Scientology is that they will sue your ass. If you try to expose them or try to leak things, like they will come after you however they can legally. In 2003, Keith Raniere and other high-ranking people at NXIVM were invited to participate in interviews with Forbes, and they were all under the impression that the outlet was writing a positive story on how NXIVM helped people. But instead, Forbes published a scathing story featuring allegations that NXIVM was a cult and evidence to back them up. And the article featured comments from Edgar Bronfman. His daughters Claire and Sarah Bronfman were early supporters of the organization. They had deeper pockets than most to support NXIVM's endless legal battles. Edgar told Forbes that he believed his daughters had been manipulated into giving a substantial amount of their fortune to a cult. And in later years, it came to light that the sisters had, quote unquote, loaned NXIVM $2 million. But instead of a cash reimbursement with interest, the loan was repaid through private phone calls and fitness sessions. Whatever the fuck that means. And obviously it was way more than $2 million. NXIVM leaders fiercely defended their reputation by taking legal action against anyone who criticized them and against former members who spoke out about their experiences. The cult used its expansive wealth and the wealth of supporters like Claire and Sarah Bronfman to file lawsuits against anyone who left NXIVM. For good measure, leaders even gave false statements to law enforcement officials to encourage bogus criminal investigations against defectors. NXIVM members called the defection of former members, quote unquote, the fall, and labeled them Luciferians, lost people for whom bad feels good and good feels bad. And by 2014, Keith Raniere upped his game in his defense of NXIVM. He founded a fake news website called The Knife of Aristotle to spread propaganda. Members rarely saw adverse media reports about their leader, NXIVM, because Keith slandered any news that couldn't come from The Knife of Aristotle. He told members that watching or reading other sources of news was traitorous. The tentacles of NXIVM reached beyond a single organization. Various societies for women and men associated with NXIVM were developed to identify new recruits, and even an international chain of child care centers called the Rainbow Cultural Garden was established in 2006. And these fucking Rainbow Cultural Gardens are still operating today in France, Guatemala, and the United Kingdom.
Oh my gosh.
And this program claims that it can teach children as young as 2 years old up to 7 languages simultaneously.
That's got to be so confusing as a 2-year-old. What the hell?
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah. But in reality, according to cult expert Rick Allen Ross, he said that it has nothing to do with teaching languages to children. It's about indoctrinating children to be like Keith Raniere. He was the prototype, and he was always interested in cloning himself and perpetuating his ideas. So it's literally a way to keep his legacy going, is what these child care centers are.